My husband and I once had a beach house in Florida, but we moved to the city. I hadn't gone there in 23 years, but he went there 4 times a year. After he died, my son said, "Sell that useless house, mama." I decided to visit before selling. When I opened the rusty gate, I stood frozen after I saw who was living there. We bought that house the same summer we got married, back when neither of us had 2 nickels to rub together. And the only thing we could afford on that stretch of coast was a fishing shack with a roof that leaked every time it rained harder than a drizzle. I remember standing in the front room the day we got the keys, looking up at a water stain shaped like Ohio, and my husband laughing so hard he had to sit down on the floor because we didn't own a single stick of furniture yet. We spent the better part of a decade fixing that place up ourselves. Weekends, mostly. He'd drive down on a Friday after work with a truck bed full of lumber he'd priced out at 3 different hardware stores to save a few dollars, and I'd follow with sandwiches and a cooler and whatever tool he'd forgotten. We replaced the roof ourselves, the 2 of us up there with tar paper and a manual we'd bought secondhand, sunburned and arguing about nail spacing. We built the porch that wrapped around the south side. We planted a lemon tree that never did produce much, but it grew tall and shaded the kitchen window in the afternoons, and I loved it anyway. For those years, that house was the center of everything. Every holiday we could manage, every long weekend we were down there with sand still in the car mats from the last trip. Our son took his first steps on that porch, wobbling between my husband's outstretched hands and the porch post, and there's a photograph somewhere in a box in our attic of him falling directly into the flower bed, mouth open in the particular outrage only a toddler can manage. Then life did what life does. My husband's company offered him a promotion that meant relocating inland, closer to the city, and it wasn't the kind of offer either of us felt we could turn down with a young son and a mortgage and the ordinary math of a family trying to get ahead. We told ourselves the beach house wasn't going anywhere. We told ourselves we'd get back to it every chance we got. For the first couple of years, we did. Then our son started school, and school meant a calendar that didn't bend for beach trips the way our lives once had. Soccer seasons, parent-teacher conferences, 100 small obligations that individually meant nothing and collectively meant we hadn't been back to Florida together in longer than either of us wanted to admit out loud. My husband kept going, though. That was the strange part looking back. Even as our trips together dried up entirely, his solo trips became almost sacred to him. 4 times a year, like clockwork, he'd pack a single duffel bag, kiss me goodbye, and drive the 4 hours down by himself. He never missed a trip. Not once in 23 years. Not for illness, not for weather, not for the year our son broke his arm the week before one of those trips was scheduled. And I assumed, wrongly, that he'd cancel. He didn't cancel. He made sure our son was settled, made sure I had everything I needed for the week, and he went anyway. I asked him to come along a handful of times in those early years. He always had a reason it wasn't the right trip for that. Once it was that he needed to deal with some repair alone because it wasn't safe for me to be climbing around on a bad step. Once it was that he just needed a few days of quiet before some deadline at work. I stopped asking around year 3. Not because I stopped wondering, but because it became clear. In the particular way these things become clear inside a marriage without anyone ever having to say it directly, that whatever he needed down there had stopped being something we shared and had become something that was only his. I told myself it was fishing. I told myself it was the kind of solitude a man sometimes needs and a good wife doesn't begrudge him for wanting. I told myself a great many things over 23 years, and the truth is, I never once drove down there myself to check whether any of them were real. It was easier not to know. I understand now that I built an entire marriage's worth of peace on top of not knowing, the way you might build a house on sand and simply choose not to think about the tide. He died on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly, before either of us had finished our coffee. One moment he was reading me something from the newspaper about a storm system building in the Gulf, and the next he had simply stopped, folded forward over the table like a man who'd decided, all at once, that he was tired. The doctors called it his heart. They said it could have happened at any time, that there was nothing anyone could have done differently, that these things sometimes give no warning at all. I believed them. I still believe them. It doesn't change how strange it feels to lose someone over the exact sentence he was in the middle of saying. Our son handled almost everything in the weeks that followed. The funeral home, the obituary, the insurance paperwork, the endless phone calls to close accounts and transfer titles. He's always been that way, methodical and capable under pressure. The kind of man who processes grief by making lists and crossing things off them. And I was grateful for it, even as some small part of me wished he'd let himself fall apart a little, instead of holding both of us up with spreadsheets. It was about 2 weeks after the service when he brought up the house. We were sitting at my kitchen table, the good china still out from a meal neither of us had eaten much of, and he set down his coffee and looked at me with the particular gentleness he reserves for delivering news he's already decided is final. "Mama," he said, "we should talk about the Florida house." I told him there wasn't much to talk about. It would sit there until I had the energy to deal with it, same as it had sat there for years already. "That's the thing," he said. "It's not just sitting there costing nothing. There's taxes on it every year. Insurance, if Dad even kept it insured, which I have no idea about. It's 4 hours away from either of us. What are you going to do? Drive down there every few months to make sure the roof hasn't caved in?" I didn't have an answer for that, because the honest answer was that I hadn't thought about the house in any real way in years. It had simply existed in the background of my life the way distant relatives exist, present in theory, absent in practice. "I think you should sell it," he said. "I know it meant something to you both once, but it's just sitting there falling apart now, and Dad's gone, and holding onto a building because of memories isn't the same as holding onto the memories themselves. You could use the money. Take a trip somewhere that doesn't require you to manage a whole second property you never even visit." He wasn't wrong wrong exactly. Everything he said had the clean, sensible shape of good advice, the kind any reasonable person would nod along to. And yet something in me resisted it immediately, before I could even name why. Let me think about it, I told him. Don't think too long, he said, not unkindly. That house isn't doing anyone any good just sitting there empty. I told him I understood. What I didn't tell him, because I hadn't fully admitted it to myself yet, was that I had no real idea what condition that house was even in anymore. I didn't know if the roof we'd replaced together had held up, or if the porch we'd built had rotted through, or if the lemon tree that never produced much fruit was even still standing. I had built an entire decade of comfortable not knowing around that house, and now my son was asking me to make a decision about a place I could no longer accurately picture in my own mind. I decided that same week that I would drive down myself before I signed anything away. I didn't tell my son. I told myself it was simply practical, that I couldn't authorize a sale of something I hadn't laid eyes on in over 2 decades. I didn't examine too closely why my hands were shaking slightly as I packed an overnight bag, or why some part of me felt less like I was preparing to assess a property and more like I was preparing to finally ask a question I'd spent 23 years too afraid to ask. The drive down felt longer than 4 hours. It felt longer than the 23 years since I'd last made it, if that makes any sense at all. I remember every mile marker of that route once. Back when we drove it together so often, I could have made the turns with my eyes closed, and I kept waiting for that old familiarity to return to me somewhere along the interstate. It never quite did. The gas stations had changed hands. The billboards advertised businesses I didn't recognize. Even the light seemed different by the time I crossed into the county, thinner and more silver than the gold I remembered from summers spent down there as a young wife. I stopped once, about an hour out, at a diner we used to frequent on our drives when our son was small enough to need a break every couple of hours. It was still there somehow, though it had a different name now and a different family running the register. I sat in a booth by myself and ordered coffee I didn't really want, mostly because I needed a few minutes to sit still before I let myself get any closer to that gate. I thought about calling my son from that booth. I thought about telling him where I was going, what I was doing, so that if anything happened to me on that lonely stretch of road, somebody would know where to start looking. In the end, I didn't call. Some part of me understood even then, before I knew anything at all, that whatever I found at that house was going to be mine to sit with first, before it became anyone else's business. The turnoff onto the old county road was more overgrown than I remembered, scrub brush pressing in close on either side where there used to be a clear shoulder. I almost missed it entirely and had to circle back, my heart already beating harder than the drive alone accounted for. When I finally found the right stretch and the house came into view through the trees, I had to pull over onto the gravel and sit there a moment with both hands on the wheel, just breathing. 23 years is a long time to hold a picture of somewhere in your head and never once update it. I had expected ruin. I had braced myself the whole drive down for a collapsed roof, for windows boarded or broken, for the kind of decay that swallows a wooden structure whole once nobody's there to fight back against the salt air and the humidity and the slow, relentless work of the coast. That isn't what I found. The yard wasn't the jungle of waist-high weeds I'd pictured. The grass was cut, not manicured exactly, but tended, the way grass looks when somebody runs a mower over it every couple of weeks rather than letting it go entirely feral. There was a hose coiled with more care than I would have expected by the side of the house, looped in neat, overlapping circles on a wall hook that hadn't been there the last time I'd seen this place. A pair of gardening gloves sat drying on the porch railing, the fingers curled slightly from repeated wetting and drying in the sun. None of it made sense to me in the moment. My first thought, foolish as it sounds now, was that perhaps the county maintained abandoned properties in some way I'd never known about, some ordinance requiring lawns be kept below a certain height. It was easier to imagine bureaucracy than to imagine what the yard actually suggested, which was that somebody had been living here, or at least tending to this place with the regularity of someone who considered it partly their responsibility. I got out of the car slowly. The air hit me the way it always used to, salt and something green underneath it, and for one disorienting moment I felt 26 years old again, stepping out of a truck with a cooler in my arms and my whole life still ahead of me instead of scattered somewhere behind. The gate was exactly as rusted as I'd feared everything else would be. It had been white once, a simple picket thing my husband built the same summer we redid the roof, and now it was more orange than white, the hinges eaten through with rust that flaked off in my palm the moment I gripped it. It screamed when I pushed it open, a high, protesting sound that seemed too loud for the quiet afternoon, birds startling up out of the scrub brush at the noise. I stepped through into the yard, wiping rust flakes off on my slacks, and that is when I saw her. She was standing on the porch near the top of the steps, one hand resting on the post as though she'd been in the middle of coming down when she heard the gate and simply froze in place instead. A woman, somewhere in her late 60s or perhaps older, it was hard to tell exactly, with gray hair pulled back loosely and skin weathered the deep, permanent tan of someone who spends most of her days outdoors rather than someone visiting for a season. She wore a faded house dress, the kind with small printed flowers that have gone soft and pale from years of washing, and she was barefoot, standing on those old porch boards like she'd stood there 10,000 times before and would stand there 10,000 times again. She looked as startled to see me as I must have looked to see her. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I remember the specific quality of that silence, the two of us simply staring across a stretch of tended grass at each other like a pair of animals who'd stumbled into the same clearing and hadn't yet decided whether the other one posed a threat. My first instinct, the honest one, was to turn around and get back in my car. Whatever this was, whoever this woman was, it was not what I had driven 4 hours expecting to find, and every reasonable part of me understood in that instant that I had just walked into something far larger larger than an overgrown yard, and a decision about a real estate listing. My second instinct arrived close behind the first, and it was anger. Sharp, immediate, the particular kind of anger that comes from feeling robbed of something before you've even understood what's been taken. Who are you? I wanted to demand. What gives you the right to be standing on my property, tending my yard, wearing that house dress like you belong here more than I do? I opened my mouth to say some version of exactly that, but before I could get a single word out, the woman spoke first, and what she said stopped everything in me cold. She said my husband's name, not as a question, not the way a stranger might say a name uncertainly, testing whether it belonged to the person standing in front of them. She said it the way you say a name you've said 1,000 times before, a name worn smooth in your mouth from long familiarity, and she said it the way a person says a name when they've spent years quietly expecting the day would eventually come when they'd have to say it out loud to somebody else. I stood there in that overgrown gate, one hand still resting on the rusted latch, and I felt the entire 23 years of easy, comfortable, not knowing collapse in on itself all at once. How do you know that name? I finally managed. My voice came out smaller than I intended, less demand than genuine question. She didn't answer right away. She looked at me for a long moment, something moving behind her eyes that I would later understand was her doing the same math I was doing, trying to decide how much of this conversation she was prepared to have standing in a yard with rusted gate flakes still clinging to both our hands. You must be his wife, she said finally, and hearing it put that way, so plainly, was almost more disorienting than hearing my husband's name had been a moment earlier. I told her yes, that I was, and asked again, more insistent this time, how she knew either of our names, what she was doing on this property, why the yard looked tended and the hose looked used and the gardening gloves on that railing looked like they belonged to someone who considered this her home rather than a stranger's abandoned house she'd simply wandered into. She glanced past me once toward the road, the way a person looks when they're checking whether a conversation is about to have witnesses. Then she looked back at me and something in her posture seemed to settle, like a decision had been made somewhere behind her eyes that this conversation was finally, after however long she'd been dreading it, going to happen. Would you like to come inside first? She said. Sit down. This isn't really a doorstep kind of conversation. I should have refused. I should have demanded answers right there in the yard, standing my ground the way I imagine a more forceful woman might have. Instead, I found myself nodding, some part of me already understanding that whatever this woman was about to tell me, I was going to need to be sitting down to hear it properly. The inside of the house was nothing like I expected either. I had braced myself walking up those porch steps behind her for the particular smell of neglect, mildew, and dust, and the stale trapped air of rooms nobody opens windows in anymore. Instead, the kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and something baking, and the counters, though clearly old, were clean and worn smooth in the specific way surfaces get worn when somebody uses them every single day for years on end. She gestured for me to sit at a small table by the window, the same window I realized with a small jolt that used to look out over the lemon tree my husband and I planted the summer we bought the place. I could see it was still there, taller now, gnarled with age, and for one absurd moment all I could think about was whether it had ever produced fruit in the years since we'd stopped tending it. Would you like something to drink? She asked. I have tea. Coffee's from this morning, might be a bit strong by now. I told her I didn't need anything, that what I needed was an explanation, and she nodded like she'd expected exactly that answer and had simply been buying herself a few more seconds before she had to give it to me. She sat down across from me, folded her hands on the table, and told me her name. I won't say it here, not because it matters to keeping this story straight, but because somewhere in the months since that afternoon, I've come to think of it as hers to share, not mine to broadcast. She told me her name, and then she sat with it a moment, watching my face the way you watch someone's face when you're about to say something you suspect will change how they see everything that came before it. I know this is going to be difficult to hear, she said. I've thought about this conversation for years, wondering how I'd ever explain it if the day came. I don't think I ever found the right way, so I'm just going to tell you as plainly as I can, and you can ask whatever you need to after. I told her to go ahead. Years ago, she said, there was a hurricane, a bad one of the ones that made everyone up and down this coast evacuate whether they wanted to or not. I didn't have anywhere to evacuate to. That's not something I'm going to explain in detail, not because I'm trying to keep secrets from you on top of everything else, but because it's its own long story and not the one you drove down here for. What matters is that I ended up sheltering in the garage of this house because it was the only structure nearby with a door that would still lock, and I told myself I'd move on as soon as the storm passed and I had somewhere else to go. She paused there, her hands still folded on the table, knuckles pale where she was gripping her own fingers. Your husband came down not long after that storm passed. One of his regular trips, I'd learn later, though I didn't know that yet. He found me in that garage. I'd been there 3 days by then, I think, maybe 4. I'd lost track a little. I was expecting him to call the police, and I understood if he did. I was trespassing on his property. Plain and simple, whatever the circumstances that had put me there. He didn't call anyone, I said. It wasn't a question. Somehow, I already knew. She shook her head slowly. He didn't. He asked me a few questions, gentle ones, the kind that don't feel like an interrogation, even though they are one. Where I'd come from, whether I had family, whether there was somewhere safer he could take me. I didn't have good answers for any of it. And instead of pressing me on it, he just sat down on the garage floor across from me, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and he said something I've never forgotten. Her voice caught slightly there, and she took a moment before continuing. He said, everybody deserves somewhere that's theirs, and this house has more room in it than any one family needs 4 times a year. I sat with that sentence for a long moment. It sounded exactly like him. Not the words themselves, necessarily. naturally, but the shape of the thought behind them. The particular kind of quiet generosity my husband carried his whole life, the kind he rarely announced or explained, just acted on and let speak for itself. He told me I could stay, she continued, not in some vague, temporary way. He meant it as an actual arrangement, one with terms, because I think he understood I'd have refused an act of pure charity, and he was giving me a way to accept help that let me keep some dignity about it. He said I could live here, in this house that sat empty 11 months out of the year anyway, on one condition: I kept it standing. I kept the grass cut, kept the salt air from eating through everything the way it does to a place nobody maintains, kept the pipes from freezing on the rare cold snap, kept the whole structure from sliding slowly into the ocean the way so many of these old coastal houses eventually do when nobody's paying attention. And the taxes, I said, remembering the lemon tree, the tended yard, the sheer impossibility of a house surviving 23 years of Florida weather without real maintenance behind it. The insurance. He handled all of that himself, she said. Every time he visited, 4 times a year, like you said, he'd bring cash for anything I needed done around the property that was beyond what I could manage myself. A new water heater once, storm shutters another time after a bad season made him nervous about the windows. He paid the taxes directly, I believe, through whatever accounts he kept for the house. I never saw a bill. I never handled money that wasn't what he handed me directly for groceries or repairs. I sat there trying to reconcile the man I'd been married to for over 30 years with the man being described to me across that kitchen table, and finding, to my own surprise, that there was no real contradiction to reconcile. It was him. Every detail she gave me sounded exactly like him. The same quiet competence, the same instinct toward fixing a problem privately, rather than making a show of having fixed it. Why didn't he tell me? I asked. My voice came out rawer than I intended. All the frustration of 23 years of not knowing, finally finding somewhere to land. Why keep this from me? From our own son? I understand keeping a secret from strangers, but this was his family. I was his wife. She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, there was something careful in how she chose her words, like she'd turned this exact question over in her own mind many times across the years and never landed on an answer that fully satisfied her either. I asked him that myself more than once, she said. Early on, especially, I told him it didn't sit right with me, being a secret kept from his own wife. He said it wasn't really about secrecy in the way I was thinking about it. He said the two of you had built a whole life together up in the city, a good one, and he didn't want to bring something into that life that might complicate it, or worry you, or make you feel obligated to think about a stranger living in a house that was supposed to be a simple family memory, rather than something more complicated. That sounds like an excuse, I said, and I meant it, though there wasn't much heat left in how I said it. Mostly exhaustion. Maybe it was, she said. I won't defend him on every point. I think there was some truth in what he told me, and I think there was probably some part of him that simply found it easier not to explain something that would have required a difficult conversation. I can't tell you which part was bigger. I only know what he told me, and what I observed of him across 23 years of him showing up here 4 times a year like it was the most important obligation in his life. I asked her then, the question that had been building under everything else since I first stepped through that gate. I asked her why she'd stayed the entire 23 years, why she'd never moved on to build some other life once she'd had time to get back on her feet, once the initial crisis that had put her in that garage had presumably passed. She looked down at her folded hands for a long moment before she answered. Where would I have gone? She said quietly. I want you to understand this wasn't charity I outgrew, like a coat that no longer fit. This became my home, not the beach house that belonged to your family on paper. My home in every way that word means something to a person. I planted a garden out back you probably haven't seen yet. I know every creak in these floorboards, every window that sticks in humid weather, every place the roof needs a new patch before the next hard rain. I built a whole quiet life here, tending a house that gave me shelter when I had nowhere else, and being useful to a man who asked for nothing from me except that I take care of a place he loved and couldn't get to as often as he wanted. And he never asked you to leave, I said. In 23 years. He never asked me to leave, she confirmed. If anything, I think he came to depend on the arrangement more than either of us expected at the start. I kept the house alive for him in the 11 months a year he couldn't be here himself. He kept me safe in a way I'm not sure I could have managed entirely on my own. I think we both understood, without ever quite saying so directly, that we'd become something like family to each other, in our own strange, specific way. Not the kind you'd put on a holiday card, but real, all the same. I sat with that for a long moment, looking past her at the window, at the lemon tree we planted together 30 years ago, now grown tall enough to shade half the yard, tended all this time by a stranger my husband had quietly folded into the architecture of his life without ever telling me she existed. I still don't understand why, I said finally. Why keep it from me specifically? Not the world, me. She met my eyes then, steady, like she'd been waiting for this exact question and had an answer she'd carried a long time, ready to give if the day ever came that I asked it directly. I think, she said slowly, that your husband believed some kindnesses are only real if nobody's watching you do them. I think he liked that this was his, quietly, something he did because it was right rather than something he did to be seen as a good man for doing it. I don't think it was about hiding something shameful from you. I think it was closer to the opposite. I think it was the one part of his life he got to keep simple and unwitnessed, in a world where a man's whole life otherwise gets measured and discussed and turned into a story other people tell about him. I didn't have a response to that. I still don't know that I do. Months later, sitting here trying to put all of this into words for anyone else to understand. There's something else, she said, after a silence that had stretched stretched long enough to feel like its own kind of answer. Something he asked me to keep in case a day like this one ever came. I think you should see it before you decide anything else about this house. She led me back outside onto the porch to a wooden bench built into the railing near the top of the steps. The kind of built-in seating my husband always favored because he said freestanding furniture on a porch just gave the wind something to throw around during a storm. I remembered him building that bench actually. One of our last summers coming down together as a young family, our son small enough to nap in the shade underneath it while we worked. She knelt down in front of it, moving carefully in the way people move when their knees have given them trouble for years, and worked her fingers along the edge of one of the floorboards that made up the bench's base. It took her a moment to find the right pressure point, but when she did, the board lifted with a soft, worn ease that told me this wasn't the first time it had been opened, not by a long measure. Underneath was a shoebox. Ordinary, unremarkable. The cardboard gone soft at the corners from years of humidity but otherwise intact, protected, I realized, by a layer of what looked like heavy plastic sheeting someone had carefully wrapped around it before tucking it into that hidden space. She lifted it out with both hands, held it a moment like it carried more weight than a cardboard box reasonably should, and then set it on the bench between us. He asked me to keep this here, she said. He told me if anything ever happened to him, someone would eventually come looking. Maybe you, maybe your son, eventually, if not you. He said whoever it was, they'd need to find this, and it needed to survive whatever came before they did. Weather, time, anyone else who might come around this property with less good intentions than family. What is it? I asked, though some part of me had already begun to suspect. The way you suspect the shape of something before you've actually seen it clearly. Open it, she said. It should be you who does that first. My hands weren't entirely steady as I worked the lid free. The cardboard had softened enough over the years that it came apart slightly at one corner, and I had to be careful lifting it the rest of the way. Inside, arranged with a neatness that told me somebody had handled these contents with real care over a long period of time, were report cards. I recognized the handwriting immediately, faded and blue-inked, though it took me a moment to place it correctly as belonging to our son, from an age before he'd have thought to sign anything himself in his own hand. There were 7 of them, one for each grade of his elementary years, each one showing the small, proud gold stars and encouraging teacher's notes of a boy who'd been, by every account, an easy and eager student. I asked her how these had ended up down here, 4 hours from the house where our son actually grew up, in a shoebox hidden under a porch bench in a place he'd likely never even visited as a child. Your husband brought them, she said. Every visit, for years, he'd bring something like this. A report card he'd asked the school to send a copy of, I believe, though I never asked exactly how he managed that without your knowledge. A drawing your son had made. Little things that most people wouldn't think twice about keeping, but that clearly mattered to him enough that he wanted them somewhere safe, somewhere permanent. Beneath the report cards were birthday cards, a whole stack of them, and I recognized these instantly because I remembered choosing several of them myself years earlier, remembered writing inside them in my own hand before handing them to my husband to give to our son on some birthday or another. I had assumed, when I hadn't found them again in later years while going through old boxes, that they'd simply been lost somewhere along the way, another casualty of the several moves our small family had made over the decades. They hadn't been lost. My husband had kept them, quietly pulled them from wherever they'd ended up in our house and brought them here, to be kept safe in a place he apparently trusted more than our own attic. He was sentimental about your son in a way he didn't always show, she said, watching my face as I worked through the stack. I think some men are like that. They don't always know how to hold on to things openly in the middle of an ordinary life without it looking strange to the people around them, so they find somewhere else to hold on to it instead. Beneath the birthday cards, at the very bottom of the box, was a passbook. The old-fashioned kind, a small paper booklet meant to be updated by hand at a bank teller's window rather than checked on a screen, its cover worn soft at the edges from repeated handling. I opened it with hands that had stopped pretending to be steady several minutes earlier. Our son's name was printed on the first page, in the careful cursive of whatever bank clerk had originally opened the account, along with a date. I did the arithmetic without meaning to, the way you do when a date appears in front of you and your mind simply reaches for its significance on its own. It was the same month our son was born. The pages that followed were filled with entries, dozens of them, stretching across decades in the same careful hand, though the ink color and pen pressure shifted subtly from entry to entry in a way that told me these deposits had been made over a very long span of time, rather than all at once. The amounts were small individually, $20 here, $15 there, once memorably, an entry for exactly $4.30, which struck me as such a strange, specific human amount that I found myself laughing quietly in the middle of everything else I was feeling. He'd make a deposit every time he came down, she explained, watching me work through the pages. Whatever he had on him that trip that he felt he could set aside without it being missed from the family budget. Sometimes it was more. There's a larger entry there, I believe, from a year he'd mentioned getting an unexpected bonus at work. Mostly it was small. I think that was intentional, in its own way. He didn't want it to be the kind of money that required an explanation to anyone. He wanted it to be the kind of money that simply accumulated, quietly, the way a good habit accumulates, until one day it had become something real. I turned to the last page, to the most recent entry, dated only a few months before he died, and looked at the running balance beside it, just over $11,000. I sat there on that porch bench for a long moment, the passbook open in my lap, the shoebox beside me with its report cards and birthday cards spread out between us like evidence in a case I hadn't known was being built. $11,000 accumulated in small patient deposits across more than 2 decades, hidden in a shoebox under a bench on a porch 4 hours hours from the family it was meant for. Tended and protected all that time by a woman my husband had quietly folded into his life, and never once mentioned to the wife who shared his bed every night for 30 years. He never told me any of this, I said. It wasn't really a question, but she answered it anyway. No, she agreed. I don't believe he told anyone. I think, in his own way, this was the truest thing he ever built. Not because it was large, you can see for yourself it isn't a fortune, but because it was entirely his, given without any expectation of ever being thanked for it, protected quietly across more years than most people manage to keep anything a secret at all. I thought about my son, sitting in his own kitchen right now, probably, waiting for me to call and confirm that I'd be signing paperwork to unload a useless old house that had been nothing to him but an inconvenient line item on an estate to settle. I thought about how he'd called it that, exactly that word, useless, standing in my kitchen 2 weeks after his father's funeral, already halfway to deciding this old chapter of his father's life amounted to nothing worth keeping. He wanted this house sold for scrap lumber and whatever a quick buyer would offer for beachfront land in a hurry. His father had spent 23 years turning it into something else entirely, a shelter for a woman who'd had nowhere else to go, a quiet, patient act of generosity that asked for nothing in return. And underneath a bench on its porch, an entire hidden inheritance built one small deposit at a time, waiting for the day somebody finally came looking with the right kind of eyes to actually see what had been here all along. I sat with all of it a long while, the ocean audible somewhere past the dunes, the lemon tree we'd planted together 30 years ago, casting its afternoon shadow across a porch my husband had built with his own hands, and then quietly given away to somebody who needed it more than either of us ever had. Then I picked up my phone. He picked up on the second ring, already talking before I'd fully gotten the phone to my ear, already halfway into asking whether I'd found a realtor yet, whether I wanted him to handle the listing since he'd done something similar for a colleague a few years back and knew roughly what the process involved. "Mama, you still there?" he said when I didn't answer right away. "You're breaking up a little." "I'm here," I told him. "I'm not breaking up. I've just been sitting here a while thinking about how to say this." Something in my voice must have registered with him, because the brisk, efficient tone he'd been using dropped away almost immediately, replaced with the careful caution he'd get as a boy whenever he sensed he was about to be told something he wasn't going to like. "Say what?" he asked slowly. "Mama, what's going on? Where are you?" "I'm at the beach house," I said. There was a pause on his end, long enough that I could picture him exactly, standing in his own kitchen with the phone pressed to his ear, working through the implications of that sentence. "You drove down there? By yourself?" "Mama, why didn't you tell me? I would have come with you. That's a long drive to do alone." "I needed to see it myself first," I said, "before I let anyone else tell me what it was or wasn't worth." "Okay," he said, drawing the word out slowly, still clearly trying to catch up to whatever was happening in this conversation. "And? Is it as bad as I figured? Is the roof gone? Is it—" "The roof's fine," I said. "The house is fine. Better than fine, actually. Somebody's been taking care of it." Another pause, shorter this time, but heavier. "Taking care of it? Mama, nobody's supposed to be out there." "Who's been taking care of it?" I thought about how to answer that question in a way that wouldn't require explaining everything at once, over the phone, standing on a porch that suddenly felt like it deserved better than to have its story rushed through in a hurried conversation. "I think you need to come see this yourself," I said instead. "Not to decide anything about selling, just to see it. There are some things here that belong to you, actually. Things I think your father meant for you to have eventually. Things that belong to me," he repeated, and I could hear the frown in his voice even without seeing his face. "Mama, what are you talking about? What kind of things?" "Your report cards," I said, "from elementary school, all 7 years of them. Birthday cards I thought we'd lost years ago, and something else. Something your father was apparently saving for you, a little at a time, for over 20 years. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I glanced at my phone to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "I don't understand," he said finally, and his voice had lost every trace of the brisk efficiency he'd walked into this conversation with. He sounded for a moment exactly like the small boy who used to climb these very porch steps on unsteady legs, reaching for his father's hands. "Mama, what is going on down there? Who's been keeping my report cards in Florida for 20 years? Her name is—" I started, and then caught myself, realizing I still didn't fully know how much of her story was mine to share over a phone call, secondhand, without her sitting there to tell it in her own words the way she'd told it to me. "I think it's better if you hear this in person, from both of us. Can you come down tomorrow if you're able to get away from work?" "Mama, you're scaring me a little," he admitted. "Is everything okay? Are you safe?" "I'm completely safe," I told him, and meant it fully, in a way that surprised me given how strange the entire afternoon had been. "I promise you, whatever you're imagining right now, it isn't that. This isn't a bad thing I'm calling you about. I think, actually, it might be the best thing your father ever did, and neither of us knew anything about it until about an hour ago." He was quiet again, and I could hear him thinking, could practically hear the gears working behind his silence the way I'd been able to hear them working his whole life, since he was small enough to sit at this exact kitchen table inside this exact house, working through some problem with his forehead scrunched in concentration. "You said the house was useless," I reminded him gently, the words coming out softer than I expected them to. 2 weeks ago, in my kitchen. "You said it was just sitting there falling apart, that we should sell it and be done with it." "I remember," he said quietly. "Mama, I'm sorry if that upset you. I didn't mean—" "You didn't upset me," I said. "I'm not calling to scold you for it. I understand why you said it. From where you were standing, that's exactly what it looked like. A useless old house, 4 hours away, costing money and nothing else." I paused, looking out past the porch railing at the lemon tree, at the tended grass, at the gate I'd forced open a few hours earlier, not knowing it would lead me somewhere so entirely different from where I thought I was going. smiling. I just don't think either of us understood what your father actually built out here. All those years he kept driving down alone. I didn't understand it either, not until about an hour ago. I don't think either of us has the right to decide what this place is worth until we both understand what it actually is. Okay, he said, and this time his voice had steadied into something more resolved, more like the version of him I recognized. Okay, I'll come down tomorrow. First thing, I'll leave as early as I can. Good, I said. Drive safe. There's plenty of room for you here. More room than you'd think, actually, for a house that's supposedly been sitting empty all these years. I could hear him start to ask what I meant by that, and I let the question hang there a moment unanswered, because some things really do deserve to be seen in person rather than explained over a phone line, standing on a porch that had kept its own quiet counsel for 23 years and had earned, I thought, the right to finally tell its own story properly, in its own time, to the people who'd been waiting on it without even knowing they were waiting. Get in your car, I told him instead. You need to come see the useless house yourself.